Welcome. Good evening. It's a lovely spring evening in New York City. You could be anywhere else, but you're here with Drisha as part of our Sphere Zman with a new class. I left here full and have returned empty. Loss and recovery in the Book of Ruth, which we have the pleasure of learning with Rabba Wendy Amsellem, who has a very familiar face to Drisha students. Just to let people know what this class is about. At the start of the Book of Ruth, Naomi suffers a series of profound losses. Her husband dies, and then her sons. And even though her daughter-in-law Ruth swears her eternal loyalty to Naomi, Naomi is unmoved and reports on her return to Bethlehem, quote, "I have left here full and returned empty." Using midrash and rabbinic exegesis, we will do a close reading of the Book of Ruth and explore how Naomi's understanding of family and relationships expands. We will consider what the Book of Ruth can teach us as our community confronts the terrible losses of this year. And for those who have not had the pleasure of learning before Rabba Wendy, I just want to let people know she teaches Talmud and Halacha at Yeshivat Maharat, and she also directs their Beit Midrash program, which is a joint project of Maharat and Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. She has taught many times at Drisha, as well as at Pardes and Temple Emmanuel. She is a Musmechet of Yeshivat Maharat and an alumna of the Drisha Scholars Circle. Sources for today's class will be shared in chat once things get underway. And with that, I want to hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you. And it's so nice to see the familiar faces that I'm looking at. I don't know, people who I can't see, I don't know about, but it's so lovely to see all of you guys. I'm really excited to get to learn the book of Ruth, Megillat Ruth, for the next 3 weeks. It's one of the, I think, most beautiful books of Tanakh. And I was thinking about the story of Ruth and Naomi, especially this year, because I think we often focus on kind of the redemptive aspects of it. And I think those are definitely there and we can talk about them, but it's really also a book about profound loss. And I think this year, kind of in the wake of the attacks of October 7th, I think a lot of us are just feeling a lot of loss this year. And I think sort of thinking about the Book of Ruth from that lens is interesting, right? Interesting to sort of focus on, like, what does it mean for the different characters in the book to be sort of struggling with the losses that they have, and kind of, what suggestions might the book have for us as we think about how to move forward. Okay, so I'm going to start. Hopefully everybody has sources. If you don't, put it in the chat and Kayla will get you some sources. So we're gonna mostly be looking at the Psukim, but we do have also a couple of passages from the midrash of Rabba, and I will also be just referencing one Gemara also. Okay, so if we look over here at the beginning, source number 1, chapter 1 of Megillat Ruth, we're told, "Vayihi bimot shvot hashoftim, vayihi ra'av ba'aretz." So it's the time of the judges, and there is a famine. And we're told, "Vayelech ish mi Bethlehem Yehuda lagur b'stei Moav, hu v'ishto u'shtei banav." Right. So there's a man who lives in Bethlehem, which is in the area of Yehuda, where the tribe of Yehuda lives, and he leaves his own town. He leaves Bethlehem with his wife and sons because of the famine. Now, the idea that there's a famine and people are leaving in order to find food, this is not a new idea in Tanakh, right? Who else can we think of who has left their home because of a famine? Sandra, who are you thinking?
Abraham left. Isaac on the verge of leaving, and God said, "No, stay in Eretz Israel." It's not uncommon, I guess, to go and you go where the food is.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Nomadic. That's what you do.
Totally, right? So the fact that there's a famine and a person leaves in order to go to somewhere where there's food, this isn't a new idea. Exactly as Sandra said, we see Abraham, right? One of the first stories that we know about Abraham is that there's a famine, and he and his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot all head down to Egypt. Yitzchak, when there's a famine, is going to leave the land, but God tells him not to. Another very famous person who leaves the land is Yaakov, right? If you remember Yaakov and his sons, when there's a famine, Yosef has a lot of food in Egypt, and he tells them all to come down to Egypt. But as you might remember from these stories, leaving, right, even though the choice to leave is kind of seen as reasonable, I think, in all these stories, it's always very dangerous also, right? When Avram goes down to Egypt, his wife Sarai gets taken by Paro. When Yaakov and his sons go down to Egypt, they eventually are enslaved there. So I think on the one hand, it seems like sort of a almost mundane choice, right? Yeah, there's a famine, you go where the food is. It doesn't seem like it's a particularly sort of loaded choice to make. On the other hand, I think as soon as we see them leaving, we're already a little bit worried about this family, right? Because leaving when there's a famine kind of puts you in a vulnerable state wherever you're going, right? You're going to a place that isn't your place. You kind of need them because you need the food, and it's especially for the women, it's often pretty dangerous, right? So when we hear that there's a man and his wife and their sons who go, I think the text means for us to be a little nervous about the wife, right? What will happen to her there? One other thing that's also just interesting to think about with Bethlehem, right? Bethlehem also appears earlier in the Torah as an important place. If you remember, when Rachel dies, she's buried along the way in Bethlehem, right? The pasuk is "Vatikaver b'derech Ephrata hi Bethlehem," right? So there's a sense also that Bethlehem is associated also with danger, or at least with with the death of Rachel. So they start off in Bethlehem, they leave because there's a famine. And we're a little bit worried, perhaps, about the woman in the family, because we know that sometimes, especially, it's dangerous for women. We're worried about what might happen to the whole family there. We might also be worried about their ability to come back, right? If you remember when Yaakov and his family go down to Egypt, right? The big question is, how are they going to get themselves out of Egypt, right? All of the beginning of Sefer Shemot is an attempt to sort of get them out of Egypt afterwards. Okay, at any rate, this family, though, has just left. So now in Pasuk Bet, we're told, B'Shem Ha'ish Elimelech. So now that we've been told about, the fact that they've gone, now we're introduced to who they actually are. The man is Elimelech, the woman is Naomi. Their two sons are Machlon and Chilion. They're all from Bethlehem, Yehuda. They come to Moab and they stay there. And now, right, that all seems kind of relatively neutral. In the next 3 verses, in very quick succession, Naomi's entire world is going to fall apart, right? She's kind of made a somewhat reasonable choice to go where the food is. But we're told in verse 3, Vayamot Elimelech ish Naomi, right? Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. Vatishaer hi ushne vaneha, she and her 2 sons remain. Then in verse 4, we're told that the 2 sons marry Moabite women, Shem ha'achat Orpah, v'Shem ha'shenit Ruth. One of them is called Orpah, one of them is called Ruth. And after they marry the women, they stay there for 10 years, right? Now, it could be that it's a very long famine, right? That could be. Or it could be that once they marry the Moabite women, they're, kind of settled into society, right? They're not looking to go back. But then in verse 5, we're told, Vayamutu gam shnehem machlon b'chilion. The 2 sons also die. Vatishaer ha'isha mishne yeladea u'meisha. And the woman is left as the lone survivor of her husband and her sons. And I think this is kind of the first moment that the text kind of really lets us think about how much Naomi has lost, right? We know in verse 3 she lost her husband. Here she loses her sons, and then the verse says, and she remains alone, right? She's the only one who is left. And then in verse 6, we're told, Vatakum hi v'chaloteha. So she and her daughter-in-laws get up. Vatashov miste Moab. She decides to return back from the plains of Moab. Ki sham'a biste Moab, ki fakad Hashem et amo latet lehem lachem. Because she's heard in Moab that God has remembered God's people and has given them bread. Right now, it's a little bit of a wordplay there. Right? She's going back to Bethlehem, which is like the place of bread where there was no bread, but now there's bread again, and so she decides that she's going to go back. And we might sort of think about her going back as a hopeful gesture, right? Maybe it's that, even though she's experienced these profound losses, she kind of hopes that by going back home, things will be better. But as we read through the chapter, it really doesn't seem that way, right? It doesn't seem as if she has any sense that like anything good will happen to her if she goes back. It's more that she kind of doesn't really have any reason to stay where she is. It seems like she's interested in going back, but not because she has any sense of a better future for herself there. And that kind of becomes clear as we keep reading, right? Because it could be, right? We might have imagined that now that there's food, she'll go back. She and her daughter-in-laws can start a new life there. But I think the verses sort of make it clear as we keep going that she doesn't expect that things are going to be better for her, right? And we don't even really know exactly why she's going back, but it doesn't seem like it's based on some sort of, hope for the future. Okay, so then in verse 7, we're told, "Vatetzei min hamakom asher hayta shama." So she leaves the place where she was. U'shnei chalotea ima, her 2 daughter-in-laws are with her. Vatelachna v'derech lashuv el eretz Yehuda. And so she starts off along the way. Now, Moab, I think, is sort of modern-day Jordan, not that far from Israel, right? It's not a terrifically long journey, but they're going on foot, so it will take them a bit of time. And so she sets off on this path. And by verse 8, she's kind of ready to say goodbye to the daughters-in-law, right? So she says to them in verse 8, Lech na shovna isha levet ima. Turn back, go back, each woman to her mother's household. Ya'as Hashem imachem chesed kasher asitem im hametim be'imadi. Right, go back, each woman to her mother's household, and may God do mercy with you or deal kindly with you the way you dealt with the dead ones and with me. So I think a couple of things are worth noticing about this verse, right? One is that she sends them specifically back to Beit Ima, right? Why do you think she specifies that? Go back, each woman to her mother's house. Yeah, Sandra, please.
Well, they're not attached to anyone, and an unattached woman was a threat to the society, also dangerous for them. So they aren't attached to Naomi because they have no children. And so the only attachment that they still have now that they're widows as well as childless would be to the ones who bore them.
Okay, just 1 second, guys. I'm just going to turn on the air conditioning because it's gotten very warm here.
And just to let people know, if you are an attendee, not a panelist, and you have a question or you want to respond to Rabba Wendy, I can unmute you. You just let me know in chat or use the little raise hand icon, and I am there for you.
Okay, and if the air conditioning gets too loud, let me know. That was why I shut it off initially. Okay, so Sandra's made a great point, right? Which is that maybe they're not really attached to anybody else. The thing that I want to point out, that was often, right, if you think about it in the Bible, when when marriages end, women usually go back to Beit Aviha. They usually go back to their father's houses. And here, though, she's not sending them back to their father's houses. She's sending them back specifically, she says, right? Shovna isha lebeit ima. Each woman go back to her mother's house. And I think the reason why she's emphasizing your mother's house, is I think it's her way of basically distancing herself from them. She's saying to them, like, look, you're my daughters-in-law, but you're not really my daughters. I'm not your mother. You have an actual mother. You have a mother. Go back to your actual mother, right? We temporarily had, a relationship that was mediated by your marriage to my sons, but that relationship doesn't exist anymore. I no longer am any sort of mother to you. Go back to your own mother's houses. And but she's not saying it meanly, right? She says to them, like, you've been great, right? You dealt so kindly with me. You dealt so kindly with the dead ones. Right. It's interesting to me. She can't even use her son's names here. Right? I think there's a way in which it might be that it's like too painful for her to even say her son's names, or it might be that this is another form of distancing, right? She's saying that was in the past, right? We used to have a connection. That connection has died. And as a result, you and I, we're no longer connected at all. You go back to the people that you're actually related to. Go back to your real mothers. If you look if you scan down in the source sheet a little bit, you'll see in source number 3, we'll skip source number 2 for a moment. We'll come back to it. But in source number 3, the midrash and root Rabba wonders, like, what kind of acts of kindness did they do with the dead ones? And why is she referring to them as the dead ones? And the midrash says she's calling them the dead ones because she's referencing actually acts of kindness that they did after their husbands died. So Yas Hashem imachem chesed, if you look at source number 3, the midrash says, Rabbi Chanina bar Ada Amar, Ya'aseh kitiv kasher asitem im hametim shenitpaltem betachrichohem. Right, basically, you did mercy with your husbands after they died. You took care of their burial, of their funeral arrangements. You made sure to provide them with the proper clothing for burial. The imadi, right? You did kindness with the dead ones by taking care of them, taking care of their burial needs. And also imadi, you also did kindness with me. Shevitru la ketuboteham, right? Their husbands had given them ketubot, had promised them money after in the event that they died, and they waived their rights to the ketubah because they knew that Naomi didn't have any money to give them, right? So I mean, this is interesting in all sorts of ways, right? Because generally only Jewish women are given ketubot. The assumption of the rabbis is that at this point Naomi and Orpah are not yet Jewish, right? Because in a little bit, when Ruth makes her sort of important speech, the rabbis often see that as the moment of conversion. So it's a little bit interesting to sort of imagine that they had to vote at all. But the midrash imagines that, there was some sort of arrangement. They had some sort of marriage contract. They were going to give, they had promised their wives, Ruth and Orpah, some amount of money after they died. And Ruth and Orpah, out of sort of deference to Naomi, waived that. And so the particular kind of acts of kindness that the midrash imagines that she's referencing are acts that specifically have to do with the deaths of the sons, and that's why she refers to them as the metim, right? The acts of kindness that you did with the dead ones, you cared for their funeral needs, and with me, and that you didn't try to collect any of this money that you were supposed to get after the deaths. So I think that is certainly one way to read it. I think another way to, oh, sorry, Evelyn, do you have a question?
Yeah, just to halakhically, I guess, would she have been responsible for their 2 votes?
So in theory, right, if they were Jewish women, right, then the estate would have been responsible for them, right? So like when the sons died, any property that the sons had owned would be underneath the ketubah, and the wives could collect the money back from those estates. Now, even if they had owned property and they had subsequently sold it to somebody else, in theory, the wives could go and collect that property back if it were working kind of as a regular ketubah, and if they were Jewish women. To begin with, the moment that they're Moabite women, right, we don't know what the rules would be for the ketubah, but I think it's interesting that the midrash kind of imagines that either way, they had some money coming to them that would have come out of like the family estate, and Naomi, in theory, has like discretion over the family estate because there's no other survivors, but it sort of becomes clear, certainly by the next chapter, and even here, that like they really don't have any money, right? They're heading back to she's heading back to Bethlehem, but she doesn't have anything with her. Okay. Trying to think about whether we should, let's keep going, and then we'll see that initial midrash about their financial situation afterwards. Okay, so we are up to in verse 8, right? She tries to persuade them to leave her, and she does it basically by kind of taking herself out, sort of indicating that she's not really in a relationship with them, right? She's saying, you have real mothers, I'm not your mother, go back to your mother's house. And also the people who used to connect us, my sons, they're just dead ones now, right? They're not part of our story anymore, and so therefore you should go back. There's nothing left between you and me. Right? Not because she's mad at them, right? She's very kind to them. She blesses them. She says, may God deal as kindly with you as you dealt with us. But that's it, right? She doesn't assume that there should be any continued connection. She goes even further in verse 9 by saying, Yitain Hashem lachem u'mitzena minucha isha beit isha. May God grant you that each one of you find a minucha, like I see it translated here as security, but it's not really security. It's more like a respite, right? A resting place, a respite in the home of your new husband, right? So first she's sending them back to their mother's household, and now she's kind of blessing them that they sort of find themselves kind of a good place to be with a new husband. And then she kisses them, right? She's kind of done. This is her saying goodbye. She's saying, look, you used to be married to my sons. My sons are now dead. You have real mothers. You have a future in which you can hope for new husbands. And I'm not a part of that future. So thanks a lot. Hope God, may God bless you. She kisses them, and they cry. And this could have been the end of the story, right? She's made sort of a reasonable argument. She said to them, like, we're not really connected anymore. See you later. But it turns out that the 2 daughters-in-law are very insistent. And so in verse 10, they say to her, they say, no, we want to come back with you to your nation, right? We understand that like we have our real mothers in Moab, but actually we want to stay with you. We want to stay with you, and we want to come back with you to your nation. And I think at this point, if you look at sort of the difference in tone between verses 8 and 9 and verses 11 and 12, Naomi kind of, it feels to me like Naomi sort of changes her way of speaking, right? She sort of becomes very practical now, right? In the beginning, it's sort of flowery, right? May God be so good to you. You were so kind to us, sort of a generalized thing. Now she becomes very practical. And she says to them in verse 11, Shovna binotai lama telachna. Go back, my daughters, turn back. Why should you come with me? Ha'odli banim b'me'ai v'hayu lachem la'anashim. Do I have any more sons inside of me that you can marry? Now, two things are happening in this verse. On the one hand, she's telling them that she has no connection to them. On the other hand, she is calling them benotai, right? It's a little bit of a mixed message, right? To call them my daughters, but also to basically be saying like, we have no family connection. And she spells out exactly why they have no family connection. She says, I'm not hiding any other sons, right? I don't have any sons inside of me that I can give you, right? My whole relationship with you, Naomi says to them, is mediated through the fact that you were married to my sons. And now that I don't have any sons, we don't have any connection to one another. Do you think I have other sons that you can marry? And she goes even further in verse 12. She says, Shovna benotai lechna, turn back my daughters and go, kizakanti meyotish, because I am too old to be with a man. Ki amarti yeshli tikva, even if I were to say that perhaps I have a hope, gam hayiti halayla leish, even if I were to sleep with a man tonight, vigam yaladati banim, and I were to conceive and I were to have sons, right? Naomi says this cannot happen. I'm too old to have any more sons. But even if it could happen, right? Even if miraculously I could conceive tonight, halahem tisaberna, are you really going to wait for these baby sons to grow up, adasher yigdalu, until they become adults? Halahem teagena, are you going to sort of chain yourselves to them or prevent yourselves, levilti heyot leish, from marrying anybody else? Just this doesn't make any sense, right? I don't have anything to offer you. I have no other sons now. Even if I had more sons now, she says, which can't happen, but even if miraculously I had sons, that they wouldn't be appropriate for you, right? Would you wait for these babies to grow up in order to marry them? I don't have anything to offer you anymore. And so therefore, you should really turn back. And I think in this moment, we really understand that Naomi's perspective on her relationship with the daughters-in-law is that, their only connection was that she had sons, and when she had sons, she had something to offer these women. But without sons, she basically says, well, there's nothing to bind us together, right? There's nothing to hold us together. And because I don't have any other sons to offer you, there's no reason for you to be with me, right? Go back to your actual mothers, find yourselves new husbands. I'm of no use to you anymore. There's nothing at all that will join us together. She ends off by saying, Al benotai ki marli ma'od mikem. She says, don't, my daughters, because I am marli ma'od mikem is an interesting phrase, right? I think you could either read it as my life is more bitter than yours. Right, you still have the capacity to go and remarry and start families, but for herself, she kind of feels like she doesn't have the option at all. Marli Ma'od Mikem might also mean like my life is bitter, maybe even because of you, right? We don't really know how Naomi feels about the fact that her sons married Moabite women, right? It's possible that maybe that was not something that she wanted, right? Many Jewish mothers are not thrilled when their sons marry non-Jewish women. So it could be that maybe, part of the undertone here is like, I didn't even really want this marriage to happen. And she ends by saying, Ki yatsa biyad Hashem, right? The reason why things are so bad for me is that God's hand has sort of struck out against me. And I think that's also an important part of her argument to notice, that Naomi feels personally persecuted by God. And she'll say this again and again throughout this. She'll say, God has it in for me, right? I am where I am, not by happenstance, but because God has done these terrible things to me. And I think that we think about loss, right? That's a really terrible aspect of loss, right? If a person feels not just that like bad things have happened to them and that they've suffered, but they've suffered because God wants them to suffer, right? That seems particularly terrible. And that's the way Naomi feels about herself, right? At the end of the chapter, if you remember, she'll talk about this more with the women of the town, but this is her perspective on her life, right? She says, God has made things bitter for me, right? Basically what she's saying to them is, leave me, right? God has treated me in this terrible way. I don't have anything more to offer you. And not only that, but you're probably better off without me because God is out to get me, more or less. Okay, Gilana has a question. That's a good question. So my sense is, so Gilana asks in the chat, how come she started off, like, why didn't she just say goodbye to them, like, in their own home in Moab? My sense is that, like, I think that often people would sort of accompany people, a little bit along the way, right? We have this sense of Abraham accompanying his visitors, right? So I think it might be that that Naomi just assumed that they were kind of walking her, up the block or whatever it is. But then when she gets to the point that she feels like now she's really ready to keep going, that's when she's like, okay, it's been really great. You've treated me so well. May God bless you. Go back to your mothers. Hope you find your husband. See you later. And that's when sort of things change, right? It doesn't feel to me from this text that she was originally planning for them to come with her and that she changed her mind, right? It seems more like she thought they were going to sort of accompany her a little bit. And as soon as, she's far enough that she thinks it's time to say goodbye, she does. And they instead are somewhat insistent. Now, it is also interesting that this whole conversation sort of happens along the way, right? It feels like they're kind of in this liminal space. They're not sort of in their homes in Moab. They're not yet in Israel. They're kind of on the way. We don't know exactly what's happening around them, but this whole conversation that she's having with them sort of happens sort of neither here nor there, kind of in the liminal space of the journey. Okay.
And there's one more question just in chat before you move on to the next thing from Stacy Lehman asking, is this similar to Jonah saying that God has abandoned him? Stacy, Stacy,
do you mean when Jonah's swallowed by the fish and he's praying? Is that the moment that you're referencing, or a different part?
I think there's like some point where Jonah kind of reaches out and says like, well, God has abandoned me, and like kind of pushes people away from him too. Doesn't he do that to the sailors or somebody? Doesn't he?
That's interesting. So at the beginning of the book of Jonah basically says to the sailors, I'm running away from God. That's why this storm is happening. Like, throw me overboard. It feels to me like that's a little different though, because there Jonah sees his behavior, like he knows that he's doing the thing that is making God cause
Right.
this, and that if he changed his mind, the storm would stop. Whereas Naomi doesn't seem to feel like she's done something necessarily that she could stop doing, right? She just sort of feels like things are really bad, and the reason why things are really bad are not accidental. Things are really bad because God is doing this to her. Which again, I think adds a whole other layer of pain to the situation, right? It's bad enough if a person is suffering, but to feel like they're suffering because God is causing that suffering specifically to them, right? That is a terrible place to be. Okay, so Naomi again is trying hard to send them away. In the beginning, she just basically said, look, we're not really connected. You have real mothers. Go back, find yourself some husbands. I hope all is well with you. When they say that they want to stay with her, that's when she becomes, in my mind, she becomes sort of much more practical, right? She basically says to them, look, what are you doing coming with me? There is nothing I can give you, right? I don't have any more sons. Even if I could have more sons, they wouldn't be appropriate husbands for you because they would be way too young. You're not going to wait for them to grow older. I don't have anything to give you, right? And so she basically says, like, don't come with me. I have nothing to offer you anymore. So she thinks she's making a very practical argument. But I think if we take a step back and we think about her argument, it's kind of interesting, right? Because it seems like what she's saying is the only thing that she can possibly imagine a woman giving another woman is like a man to connect them, right? Like she's saying like the only thing I can imagine myself having to offer you that would be of use or of interest to you are sons for you to marry. And because I don't have that, like we don't have anything to do with one another anymore, which is sort of interesting, right? I mean, and I think, there's this famous, just forgetting the name right now. I can't believe I'm forgetting the name. There's this idea that in movies there rarely are like women who speak to other women about something other than a man. I can't remember right now the name of the artist who came up.
It's the Bechdel test.
The Bechdel test. Thank you so much. Right. So she said, that basically there are very few movies in which two women speak to one another about a subject other than a man, because the assumption is that most of the movies are like kind of, even movies that appeal to women are being sort of told from the perspective of a man. And the truth is, in most books of Tanakh, it is like that as well, right? We have almost no conversations between two women in Tanakh about something other than a man. Actually, the only conversation I can think of in all of the 5 books of the Bible is if you think of baby Moshe as not a man, then the conversation between Moshe's sister and Bat Paro would count as a conversation between two women about something other than a man. But other than that, there are none, right? In fact, there are very few women who speak to each other at all, but all of Rachel and Leah's conversations are about you know, each one of them kind of wanting Yaakov in some way. Hagar and Sarah never speak to each other at all. Rivka never speaks to another woman, right? So it's very rare. And then we get to the book of Ruth, and Ruth is really the first time that we're going to see a relationship between two women. But I think part of the like interesting sort of dynamic of it is that Naomi doesn't think about it that way in the beginning, right? She sort of imagines that the only kind of point of connection that she'll have with the daughters-in-law is if they can be married to her sons. And if there are no sons for them to marry, then there's nothing for them to talk about anymore, right? What would they talk about? They have, right? And Ruth is going to sort of push back against that and say, like, actually, I just really want to be with you, Naomi. I don't really care about whether or not you have, you know, a son to provide me as a husband. But from Naomi's perspective, right, Naomi's sort of taking this kind of almost the perspective of, you know, the other books of Tanakh, right? Which is that, look, if there's no man involved, then there's nothing for the women to talk about, right? And so what's there to say anyway? And so she assumes that they should leave her. In verse 14, we're told they, Batisena kolan batifkena od, right? Both Ruth and Orpah cry, raise their voices and cry. But Orpah takes her mother-in-law's advice, right? She says, yeah, it's true. I really should go back to my mother. You really don't have anything to offer me. So she kisses her mother-in-law, and she leaves. And, you know, there are various midrashim that really fault Orpah for doing this, but I don't think that the narrative faults her for doing it. I mean, it seems like Orpah's doing something reasonable, right? It is true, right? You know, why should she not go back to her mother's household? She doesn't really have any business to do in Bethlehem. I don't think the narrator here sees Orpah as doing something negative. It's just that Ruth is going to do something extraordinary, right? Orpah leaves, and that's the reasonable choice to make. But we're told Ruth davkaba. Ruth refuses to, right? Ruth clings to Naomi. She doesn't want to leave her. And so now Naomi will try a third time, right? Naomi in verse 14, in verse 15 rather, says, she says, look, your sister-in-law, she's done the smart thing. She's gone back to her nation. She's gone back to her gods. You should go back to Ruth, right? Be reasonable, right? Do what Orpah did. Be reasonable, right? I don't have anything to offer you. Go home. Right? We don't really have any connection at all. And Ruth now, instead of kind of taking the reasonable choice, Ruth now basically makes a very beautiful, passionate speech of devotion, right? She says in verse 16, Al tifki ibi la'azvech. She says to Naomi, don't keep urging me to leave you, lashuv me'acharayich, to turn back from you. Ki el asher tilchi elech, because wherever you go, I will go. Uvasher talin yalin, wherever you sleep, I will sleep. Amech ami, your nation is my nation, ve'elohayich Elohai, and your God is my God. So several things happen here that are interesting. I think the main, for me, interesting thing is that Ruth is saying to Naomi, I don't care about whether or not you have any sons for me to marry, right? I actually just want to be with you, right? I'm interested in my relationship with you, unmediated by any other people, right? The person I want to be with is you, right? I don't want to leave you. I want to go wherever you go. I want to be with you wherever you are. You told me to go back with my sister-in-law, my nation, and my God, but actually, I'm not interested in returning to either my nation or my gods. I want to be a part of your nation and I want to worship your God, right? But she doesn't start with that, right? She doesn't start by saying, the reason why I want to go with you, Naomi, is that I'm so interested in being Jewish, right? You know, I want to go with you because I want to be part of the people of Israel. She doesn't say that, right? What she says is, I really just want to be with you. I want to be with you. I want to go where you go. I want to stay where you stay. And part of being with you is being part of your nation, which is interesting, and I think is
very personal.
It's very personal, and it's not the way the rabbis necessarily read the story, right? The story of this part over here where Ruth and Naomi are speaking is seen by the rabbis as kind of one of the key texts about conversion, right? They'll say, you know, there are 3 different times that Naomi tries to persuade Ruth to turn back, right? Remember, we saw the first time was in verse 8 when she said, Shovna, right, go back. Then again in verses 11 and 12, she tells her to go back again. And then again in In verse 15, she tells her to go back, and the rabbis say, oh, from here we learn that if a person wants to convert, we should try to dissuade them 3 times from converting, just like Naomi did with Ruth, because Ruth is going to be seen as like the paradigm of conversion. And then the rabbis will look at this conversation between Naomi and Ruth over here, and they'll say, oh, this is really the moment where Naomi teaches Ruth about various important laws that she would need to know, and Ruth accepts all of them, right? So the Gemara in Yevamot says that when Ruth says to Naomi, let me find the first part over here, when she says to her, that's where Naomi is teaching her about Tchum Shabbat, how she's not allowed to go more than 2,000 cubits outside the city limit on Shabbat. And Ruth says, that's fine, I'll go wherever you go. I won't go past where I'm supposed to on Shabbat. Uvasher Talini Alin, that's where Naomi teaches her about the laws of Yichud. And she says, no, that's okay. I'll stay with you. I don't need to be alone with any men. And then she teaches her about Basher Tamuti. Oh, sorry, we'll see one more verse. In verse 17, Ruth goes on, she says, Basher Tamuti Amut, where you die, I will die. The rabbis imagine that's where Naomi teaches her about the various forms of capital punishment that the Sanhedrin can mete out, that any court can mete out. Ruth accepts all of these things. And for the rabbis, this is the moment of her conversion, right? This is the moment where she says, I really want to be part of the people of Israel. And this is where she sort of accepts the mitzvot upon herself, which is seen as one of the key elements of a conversion, is for the person the candidate for conversion needs to be taught about some of the most important mitzvot and has to accept them. Rabbis, here we have Ruth accepting, which is certainly, I think, an important way to read the story. But I do think it's interesting that it doesn't, if we look at the verses on their pshat level, it doesn't read as strictly a conversion story, right? Because it doesn't seem like what Ruth is saying is, I most want to be, the reason why I want to go with you, Naomi, is because I really want to be part of the nation of Israel. And so I'm just going to stick with you to do that. But it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like what she's saying is, I really care about you, Naomi. I really want to be with you. And if being with you entails going back with you to your people, like, I want to do that, right? I just want to be with you no matter what. And there's something sort of very powerful about this speech, right? She says, I want to be with you until we die, right? She concludes by saying, right? Basically, is the language of taking an oath, right? By God, only death will divide us. So I think a couple of things are worth thinking at this moment, or worth questioning at this moment, right? One is, how do you think Naomi feels when she hears this speech?
I think it's amazing that she doesn't respond. There is silence.
Yeah,
it's such a powerful, passionate bunch of statements, and then there's silence. It's unbelievable.
Oh my goodness, right? It's so true, right? And we can even see, we'll see one more verse then, right? We're told in verse 18, Naomi realizes that Ruth is determined to go with her, so she stops talking to her. So the first question is, what does Naomi feel when she hears this? And maybe a related question is, what would you want Naomi to say in response? Well, maybe even let's start with the second question, right? Having heard Ruth make this speech, what would you hope that Naomi would say to her? Yeah, Sandra.
Well, what's fascinating is the "till death do us part" portion of Ruth's 2-verse amazing immortal speech. And you'd want to, if people were plighting their troth to one another, because clearly Ruth is plighting her troth to Naomi, but we hear only silence, like Debbie said before, we hear only silence. So this is very dissonant in our heads if we don't know what's happening next. If we're just new to the story, we think, wait a minute, this woman just plighted her troth to this other woman, okay? An older woman that, basically is going to this foreign place to die. And I will come with you. I will come with you. I will come with you. So 3 times she says, don't come. 3 times she says, I'm coming. 3 times she mentions a God that she may or may not know or feel for. And she says, until death us do part. And so I think what we would expect if we're in the Judeo-Christian world of romance, in any level, when somebody prostrates herself and says, I'm yours, I will do this, you would hope there would be a mutual expression on the other side. And of course, we don't get that. And I think looking a little bit ahead, we see that I can't tell you, I talked about this with a very close friend of mine today, the part where Naomi is standing at the gates of Bethlehem and she's got Ruth, who has plighted her trust, standing next to her. And she says, I have nothing. I have no one. I'm alone. I am a bitter nothingness. And I always think Ruth must just want to, turn white, fall into the ground. Am I invisible? I've been left by my husband. My husband has died, and now my mother-in-law is essentially disowning me. This is such a fraught place.
Yeah.
But the mutuality never happens.
Yeah, right. So I think, Sandra, maybe if I were to then think so if we were to say then, based on what you're saying, what would you hope Naomi would say? You'd want her to respond in some manner. Yes, Ruth, I'm so happy that you're with me.
Right.
I also want to be with you always, right? We might
no mutuality, right?
Yeah. Okay, Talia, please.
Hi. I was thinking though, even before Root talks, that Naomi kind of made it pretty clear that she didn't want them to come. And I always read it as when she says that they made her bitter, they remind her of her loss. They're just there. So she can't ever stop thinking about the fact that her sons aren't there. So it kind of makes a lot of sense to me that she doesn't respond to Ruth's whole speech. She can't really turn her down. It was very honest and very earnest, but she probably, she says it afterwards when she gets to Bethlehem that she really is very bitter. I don't think she really wants Ruth there at all.
Right, exactly. So I think this is where we have to sort of actually, then we'll take Joyce's comment in 1 second, but we have to sort of think about Ruth's speech is very beautiful if you want to be with Ruth, right? If you want to be with her, right? If you want to be with another person and they pledge their undying love to you and they say, I'll be with you always, that's a beautiful, wonderful moment. But if you don't want to be with the other person and they pledge their undying love to you and they say they're going to be with you always, that's actually kind of annoying, right? You think about it, right? Probably. Right? So we would hope for Ruth's sake that Naomi feels reciprocally, but we have no evidence from here that she does, right? And as Talia's saying, maybe Naomi doesn't want Ruth there at all. And not only is Ruth not listening to her and turning back, but Ruth is saying, not only will I not leave you today, I will leave you never, right? When you die, I will be right there, right? Which is not always welcome, right? And so I think the question of in verse 18, when we're told, when Naomi realizes that Ruth is determined to go and stop speaking, is it that Naomi really wants Ruth with her, but she feels like she can't ask her to come because she has nothing to offer her? And then when she hears this beautiful speech, she feels like she no longer has to dissuade her, but she's now happy that she's there? Or is it that Naomi really doesn't want Ruth to come? She's tried hard to dissuade her. And now after Ruth makes this whole speech, she realizes there's nothing she can say to make Ruth change her mind. And so she just kind of gives up. And so when we picture them walking, is it that now she stops trying to dissuade her and they walk together very peacefully? Or is Naomi just kind of quietly sort of storming ahead with Ruth sort of trailing behind because she won't leave? I think, the text, one of the very interesting things about it is that it leaves a lot of things open, right? And I think you could read these verses one way or the other, and they both work. And the truth is, lots of times people have multiple motivations, right? It could be that part of Naomi wants Ruth there, part of her doesn't, right? I think the verses kind of allow for both interpretations.
I think that Naomi keeps saying how miserable she is and how miserable her life is, and you kind of feel that she's in this place where she just can't escape her misery, and so there isn't room for that interplay of loyalty and that appreciation of another person's wanting to be with you.
So Evelyn, I think that's a really fantastic point. And I think it becomes even clearer when we get to the end of the chapter and we see the part that Sandra was referencing, because it feels like the way that Naomi treats Ruth at the end of the chapter is actually kind of cruel. And it doesn't feel like that is the way that Naomi is, right? Whenever we hear her speak, both earlier in this chapter and through the rest of the book, she's always very kind, right? She might be miserable, but she always speaks very kindly to, even when she's trying to dissuade them, she blesses them, right? And so she seems like she is a kind person, and yet like what she does at the end of this chapter is really mean. And I think we have to kind of try to think about like what's going on there, right? What makes her behave in that way? But let's take Joyce's comment first, and then
So two aspects, independent of their personal feelings for one another, which of course are important. Maybe nobody was worried, like, gee, am I going to have to provide and sort of, take care of, not take care of her as a youngster, but, provide food and all of that. And she has no resources. And also, would a Moabite woman be accepted back in Bethlehem? I mean, they I don't think the Israelites or whatever, they weren't really a country yet. I don't think they got along well with Moab. Maybe they were, I don't know if they were at war, but they weren't allies. So
Yeah.
you're bringing in somebody not Jewish from an unfriendly people. She might not be accepted, and that could be like a problem.
Yeah, Joyce, it's a great point. For the truth is, if the chapter begins telling us that it's during the time of the judges, and the truth is, throughout Sefer Shoftim, Moab is often at war with the people of Israel. So you're right; it's not just that she's a non-Israelite woman, but she's like from the enemy. And it could be that it's even embarrassing for Naomi, right? Maybe, nobody knows what has happened. Maybe nobody knows that her son's married Moabite women, but if she comes home with this Moabite woman who's her daughter-in-law, could be that that's not the story she wants to tell everybody. So at any rate, Naomi doesn't respond to Ruth's beautiful speech. She stops trying to dissuade her. By the way, the rabbis in Masechet Yevamot who see this as a conversion story, this is where they say that like once it becomes clear that the person really wants to convert, then you should not try to dissuade them any longer. You should immediately accept them. And they quote this verse as the proof text, right? When Naomi realizes that Ruth is determined, like then she stops speaking. And for the rabbis, the stopping to speak is not a kind of giving up, but is a like, oh, now I'm going to accept you. Okay, so they keep going.
Why do we think that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but why do we think that like Ruth is so insistent on being with Naomi? Like, is it that she's like, I feel like we don't know enough about Naomi and who she is and what she stands for, that Ruth is like, I would rather you be my mother than my mother be my mother, and that I would rather come with you to a place that is unknown to people unknown than to go back from whence I came. Like,
Yeah,
it speaks volumes about how bad Moab must have been, or how bad her home was.
it's such a good question, Stacey. It's such a good question. And the text not only doesn't tell us anything about like why Ruth is doing this, we don't even know anything about how Ruth is feeling until the middle of the second chapter, right? The middle of the second chapter is the first time that the text gives us any insight into like Ruth's internal state, which is really interesting because so much of chapter 1 is about Naomi's losses, right? She loses her husband, she loses her sons, she's left by herself. She feels that God has struck out against her. She feels so hopeless. She feels so bitter. But in theory, like Ruth has also lost her husband, right? But like we don't get a sense of Ruth's pain in the story at all, right? We don't know anything about Ruth's backstory. And so also, as Stacey points out, we don't really know why Ruth is making this choice. Is she making this choice because actually there is nothing better for her in Moab, right? That could be. Or is she making this choice because she just finds something really compelling about Naomi, right? And I think the speech that Ruth gives, it doesn't sound like what she's saying is, I have nothing better to do. I'm just coming along with you for the ride, right? It sounds like what she's saying is, no, I really want to be with you. Because if she's just along for the ride, then like once they get to Israel, she can go somewhere else, right? But it sounds like she's saying, no, I am with you always, right? And it sounds like something about Naomi moves Ruth, right? It sounds like she loves her, she cares about her, and she just wants to be with her, and she doesn't even need to articulate why, right? And the truth is, I think for most people, right, if you really love someone, it's rarely because of any one particular reason, right? There's something about Naomi that's really compelling for Ruth. In the rabbis' minds, it's not just Naomi, but it's the whole God of Israel that Ruth is choosing, which could very much be. But again, like you get the sense in the verses that that Ruth gets to the God of Israel through Naomi. There's something about Naomi that she finds really compelling. She wants to stay with her. And you know, part of being with Naomi is kind of being with Naomi's people and being, you know, being part of Naomi's religion. And Ruth is signing up for that as well. Evelyn and then Joyce. Evelyn, what is your comment, please?
If you could make, I don't know if anybody's argued this, but if you could make the argument that Ruth and Oprah converted at marriage, because Ruth says to them, go back to your gods, as if they had left their gods and need to go back.
Yeah.
That would also explain the motivation for Ruth, just like we said just now, that there's a willingness to stay attached to the gods that they got to know over their 10 years of marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. You know, the text doesn't really locate a moment of conversion anywhere, right? The text doesn't mention that. I will say that when the rabbis use the story of Ruth as a conversion narrative, they very much see this moment where she says to Naomi, "El asher tilchi elech, amecha mi Elohai Elohai." They see that as like that is the moment of conversion. Now, there are other texts like the midrash that we saw about, you know, Ruth and Orpah having ketubot that maybe indicate that, like, I don't know, maybe there was some sort of earlier conversion. But if there was an earlier conversion, then it would be very problematic for Naomi to send them back to like worshiping, you know, once they're Jewish, to send them back to worshiping the Moabite gods would be more problematic, which is why I think the rabbis kind of choose to locate the moment of conversion as only, you know, once Ruth is making this speech over here, because, you know, it certainly complicates the story if we imagine that they had already become Jewish and then Naomi is sending them back to become idolaters again. It's hard to know. It's hard to know. The story itself, as I pointed out, like doesn't really kind of locate exactly. Let's just go a drop further and then we'll take Talia's comment. Let's go a little further, right? So now we're told they get back to Bethlehem. When they get there, we're told, "Vatehom kol ha'ir aleihem," right? The whole city is agog, right? They are all shocked to see Naomi. We don't know how long Naomi is gone for, but we know that it is more than 10 years, right? Because she got to Moab, her husband died, then her 2 sons got married, then they lived there for 10 years, then the sons died, then she came back. So it's at minimum 11 years, but it sounds like probably even more than that. It's been a long time. And they say to her, "Hazot Naomi? Is this really Naomi?" And Naomi answers in this very, very sad way, right? In verse 20, she says, "Al tikrenali Naomi." No, don't call me Naomi. Naomi is from the language of Noam, of pleasant. She says, "No, that's not the right name for me anymore. I'm not the person I was when I left. Kirenali Mara. Call me instead Mara. Call me bitterness. Ki hemar shadai li ma'od." Right? Because God has dealt very bitterly with me. Ani mleah halachti, I left here full. V'rekam hashivani Hashem, but God brought me back empty, right? When I left, I had all the things I needed and wanted, and I'm coming back with nothing. I'm coming back empty. Lama tikrana li Naomi, why should you call me a name that has anything to do with pleasantness? V'Hashem anavi v'shadai herali ma'od, right? God has turned upon me, dealt harshly with me, has treated me very badly, right? So that initial statement that we saw her saying earlier when she said to her daughters-in-law in verse 13, "Marli ma'od mikem ki yatsa biyad Hashem," now this is really getting even more pronounced over here, right? She says to the townspeople, like, "I'm not the same person," right? Don't say, "Is this Naomi?" I'm not Naomi. I'm a different person. Such terrible things have happened to me that I can't even be known by the name that I was known by beforehand. And God has has sort of visited these troubles upon me specifically, right? She sees herself as kind of being, like I said before, personally persecuted by God. And as Sandra pointed out, right, there's something very troubling about her saying, "I left here full and I came back empty," right? I don't have anyone at all. She doesn't introduce Ruth to them, right? The people don't seem to notice Ruth either, right? The people say, "Hazot Naomi." They're just really shocked to see her again. She says, "I left here with a family and now I have no one," even though Ruth is standing right there. And there's something that seems really mean about that, right? Ruth has pledged her her whole existence to Naomi, and Naomi doesn't even acknowledge her for 1 second. She doesn't say, oh, I've lost my family, but here's my daughter-in-law, right? She basically says, I have no one at all. And I think that nothing about Naomi's behavior in any other part of the book would lead us to think that she's the sort of person who would be callous in this manner, right? Who would be like mean, right? If Ruth is right there to kind of totally discount her presence. And I think the only way to really explain this is that like Naomi doesn't understand what Ruth is doing there, right? It just doesn't make sense to her, right? She says, look, back when you were married to my son, I understood why we were connected, right? You were my daughter-in-law, but you're not married to my son anymore because he died. I don't have any more sons for you to marry or the capacity to produce more sons for you to marry. And so I don't think we have any bond anymore. And I don't know why you're here, right? I tried to tell you to go back. You didn't listen to me. So you're here. But I think Ruth's presence is so incongruous or discordant to the way Naomi thinks about the world that she doesn't really know what to make of her, right? She doesn't really know what to say to her. She doesn't even know how to introduce her to anybody, right? In her mind, she doesn't have any connection to Ruth anymore, which I think, is part of the trajectory of this book is that in the beginning, Naomi thinks that like the only way that she can be connected to another woman is through a man in the family. And without that, there's no connection at all. And Ruth is pushing back against that. Ruth is basically saying like, no, you're the one I want to be with, right? I want to be with you always. I want to stay where you stay. I want to worship the God that you worship. I just want to be with you. And I think at the beginning, Naomi can't even hear that because it doesn't make sense to her, right? Sometimes if we're confronted by an idea that like is sort of so foreign to the way we think about the world, like it's hard to know what to do with it, right? And I think that one way to read the remaining chapters in the book is Naomi's sort of slowly kind of figuring out what Ruth is saying to her, like how their relationship can be. And it's really only in the 4th chapter, the other women of the town eventually kind of help Naomi sort of figure out what her relationship with Ruth should be. I want to look quickly at two other midrashim that we have over here. One
just want to give you a time check before that. It is 7:13.
Yes, I see that. So let's just look quickly at source number 2. So this is a midrash from Rabba that tries to imagine, why have all these bad things happened to Elimelech? And the midrash starts by saying, Lama ne'emna she'Elimelech, right? What did Elimelech do that caused him to die, right? Because generally, leaving town because there's a famine, that's something that we've seen lots of biblical figures do, right? We don't think of that as a particularly terrible thing to do. And the response that the midrash gives is, Al yedei shehipil liban shel Yisrael aleihem. The reason why what he did was so bad is that his leaving was demoralizing for the rest of Israel. And I think one thing that's worth thinking about is that when Avram leaves, he's just one person. He's not part of a whole community, right? And when Yaakov and his family leave also, right, they're kind of a family leaving, living on their own. And when they leave, like, presumably it doesn't so much affect the people who are left behind. But once you're a part of a whole community, for Elimelech to leave is not really the same thing as for Abraham or Yaakov to leave, because there are many other people who live in Bethlehem who are also suffering. So for him to sort of choose to leave is already a different choice than these other biblical characters. And the midrash goes on to say that Elimelech was in fact very wealthy. And the midrash suggests that the reason why he leaves is not because he couldn't afford to stay. He had enough food, but he knew that in the years of famine, everybody else would come knocking at his door, and he didn't want to have to share his wealth with everybody else or his stores of food with everybody else, and so he leaves. And so what the midrash winds up arguing is that it's not really about it's not our standard tale that we've seen throughout Tanakh of there's a famine and the person leaves to go get food, because Elimelech wasn't short on food. He had enough food, according to this midrash. He just didn't want to share it. And so he leaves in order to avoid sharing what he has. And for the Book of Ruth in particular, that is a terrible crime, because the whole rest of the book is going to be about the great kindness that people show one another when they share the things that they have. And Elimelech is kind of presented in this midrash as being the foil to that, right? He's the person who has enough but doesn't want to share. And especially in the Book of Ruth, that is a terrible crime. And kind of, the opposite will be Boaz, who's happy to share kind of what he has, and Ruth, who's happy to share what she has and so forth. Okay, so I see that it's 7:15. Maybe what we'll do next week, we'll start off maybe we'll look at this midrash inside of it, because there's an interesting parable that's told. So we'll start with that midrash, and then we'll think about sort of the foil that the midrash sets up between Elimelech and Boaz, and that will be our good kind of bridge into chapter 2 of the Book of Ruth. So fun to learn with everybody. If you have any, I'm going to look at these questions in the chat right now, but also if you have any other thoughts or questions, please email me. I put my email address on the top of the source sheet, or I'm sure Kayla can give it to you. I'll just look at this. Yeah, it might be a generational gap, Gilana. That could be. I think it might also just be like just a difference in perspective. You know, it might be a generational thing, or it might just be that it's never occurred to Naomi that this could be, and Ruth has, you know, a different understanding of it. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
for
so
coming.
much.
I hope to see you all next week. And if you want to keep learning with Drisha, our next class in less than 15 minutes is comparative methods of Talmud study with Rav Yonah Haim. And with that, take care, everyone. I guess Pesach Sheni Sameach. Is that a thing now? That can be. Anyways, take care. Happy learning. Please feel welcome to reach out to Rabba Wendy with questions, and have a good day, evening, wherever you are.